The oppressive July of 1841 descended upon Virginia's South Side region with a heat that seemed to rise from the tobacco fields themselves, and that made the rolling Piedmont landscape shimmer in ways that blurred the boundaries between earth and sky. Temperatures climbing to levels that transformed labor into something approaching torture, while simultaneously serving as a brutal reminder that this was the heart of Virginia's traditional tobacco belt, where slavery had been practiced and refined across generations since the colonial period, and where the institution's mechanisms of control had been developed with a thoroughness and sophistication that made resistance seem futile to those who had internalized the lessons that systematic violence and psychological domination were designed to teach. In the slave quarters of Oak Ridge Plantation, situated in Halifax County where the economy remained dependent on tobacco cultivation, despite decades of soil exhaustion that had forced many Virginia planters to sell enslaved people south and west to feed the cotton boom, while those who remained struggled with declining productivity that created pressures manifesting in intensified exploitation of workers whose labor was expected to compensate through increased effort for agricultural challenges that actually required capital investments in fertilizers and improved farming methods that many planters could not afford. Field workers gathered in the evening darkness when temperatures finally dropped to merely unbearable levels, and spoke in voices that carried both profound fascination and considerable unease about an extraordinary situation that had been developing over the past 22 months concerning a man whose presence at Oak Ridge had fundamentally altered the plantation's power dynamics in ways that seemed to challenge everything they understood about how slavery functioned, and about the absolute nature of the authority that masters and overseers supposedly possessed over those they held as property. According to local legend that was preserved with remarkable consistency across multiple generations in oral histories, maintained by descendants of enslaved people who had witnessed events directly, and who recognized that what they were observing represented something genuinely unprecedented, that future generations needed to understand even as the reasons for such extraordinary treatment remained subject to speculation rather than certain knowledge. In September of 1839, there had arrived at Oak Ridge a man named Kwame, whose physical stature was so extraordinary that estimates of his height varied from 7 feet 4 inches to 7 feet 8 inches, depending on who was providing the account. But that universally agreed he was by far the largest person that anyone in Halifax County had ever encountered, regardless of their age or the breadth of their experience. Purchased by plantation owner Harrison Blake from a trader who had brought him from North Carolina, under circumstances that remained deliberately vague, but that several accounts suggested involved violence at his previous location, that had made the owners willing to sell him despite obvious economic value that his size and strength represented. From the moment of his arrival at Oak Ridge, the initial weeks and months proceeded according to patterns that everyone recognized from decades of observing how newly acquired enslaved people were integrated into plantation operations. Assignment to field work under the supervision of head overseer Samuel Wright, who had managed Oak Ridge's labor force for nearly 15 years, and who had gained a reputation throughout the South Side as a man who could break the most resistant workers through combinations of calculated violence and psychological intimidation. Establishment of daily routines that demonstrated the total authority that slavery claimed over every aspect of enslaved people's lives from sunrise to sunset and beyond. And the ever-present threat of whipping or other physical punishment that could be inflicted at any moment for any infraction, real or fabricated, that overseers determined required correction. But according to accounts that were preserved with extraordinary consistency in their essential details, even when specific narrative elements varied across different tellings, what happened approximately 6 weeks after Kwame's arrival would fundamentally and permanently transform the power dynamics that governed Oak Ridge in ways that no one involved had anticipated, and that created a situation so unusual that people who witnessed it struggled for years afterward to understand fully what they had observed or what implications such events carried for understanding slavery's actual operations beneath the surface of legal theories and ideological justifications that insisted the system's power was absolute and unquestionable. Wright, apparently concluding that Kwame's compliance with work assignments during the initial weeks indicated successful subordination, and that the time had come to reinforce that subordination through the ritualistic violence that was standard practice for establishing long-term psychological control. Ordered Kwame to present himself at the end of a workday for whipping on charges that multiple witnesses described as either entirely fabricated or grossly disproportionate to whatever minor infraction might have actually occurred. The specific justification mattered far less than the underlying purpose of demonstrating through physical violation and forced submission. that no one possessed any protection whatsoever from the violence that slavery could inflict whenever masters or overseers deemed such violence useful for maintaining the total dominance that the system required in order to function as its defenders insisted it must. What happened next became the subject of stories that were told and retold across generations throughout Virginia's South Side, with a consistency in essential details that was remarkable, given the obvious incentives that both slaveholders and enslaved people had to interpret events according to their own interests and perspectives. Stories that were recognized by those who heard them as carrying profound significance, not merely as accounts of specific events, but as revelations about the economic constraints on violence that slavery's ideology worked desperately to conceal, and about the possibilities for negotiating power that the system claimed were impossible. Kwame, ordered to remove his shirt and to position himself for whipping, in the manner that everyone present had witnessed countless times before in rituals designed to demonstrate slavery's absolute power through physical violation that forced submission, while an audience of other enslaved workers observed what happened to those who failed to maintain complete obedience. Instead, straightened to his full towering height that made him physically dominate the space in ways that created a reality contradicting the power relationships that slavery insisted were absolute, regardless of physical circumstances. Turned slowly to face right directly, rather than positioning himself with back turned and body bent, in the posture of submission that whipping required, and spoke words that multiple witnesses remembered with precision across decades, because of their shocking directness and their complete absence of any verbal deference or submissive tone. He stated, in a voice that carried clearly across the field so that dozens of enslaved workers heard his words directly, while others heard accounts within hours from those who had been present, that he would not submit to whipping under any circumstances, that any attempt to whip him would result in violence that would end with either his own death fighting or with the death of whoever attempted to inflict such punishment upon him, that he had decided that death fighting was preferable to accepting degradation that would establish a pattern making future violations inevitable once initial submission had been achieved, that Wright and Blake needed to understand that killing him was the only way they would ever succeed in whipping him, because he had made an irrevocable decision that no amount of force short of death would produce the submission that slavery demanded, and that they should carefully consider whether destroying $1,500 worth of property was worth whatever satisfaction they might derive from inflicting ritualistic violence that his size and strength meant would require overwhelming force to achieve, and that might very well result in serious injuries or deaths among those attempting to enforce submission, even if they ultimately succeeded in subduing him. The challenge was unprecedented in the experience of everyone present at Oak Ridge, and was nearly unprecedented in the experiences that people throughout the South Side had heard about from other plantations across decades of observing slavery's operations. Enslaved people occasionally resisted punishment through flight attempts before it could be inflicted, or through passive non-compliance that required physical force to overcome. But explicit verbal refusal delivered in clear declarative language that threatened lethal violence against anyone attempting to enforce submission was extraordinarily rare because the consequences were universally understood to be catastrophic, typically resulting in torture and public execution designed to terrorize entire enslaved communities into absolute submission through graphic demonstrations of what happened to those who imagined resistance was possible. Wright, confronted with this challenge before an audience of dozens of enslaved workers whose reactions to what happened next would fundamentally shape power dynamics across the entire plantation, and whose understanding of whether resistance was futile or potentially effective would determine how much violence and surveillance would be required to maintain control in the future, found himself forced to make an immediate decision about how to respond to defiance that threatened the entire structure of authority that his position depended upon. Attempting to whip Kwame by force would require summoning help from other overseers and possibly from Blake himself, and perhaps even from neighboring planters, if the situation escalated beyond what Oak Ridge's white population could handle. Would almost certainly result in violence that could kill or seriously injure Wright or others attempting to subdue someone whose size and obvious strength and absolute determination to fight to the death, rather than submit, meant that overwhelming force would be necessary, and that even overwhelming force might not be sufficient to avoid casualties among whites if Kwame managed to kill or disable several people before finally being subdued through sheer numbers. The situation would create a spectacle witnessed by Oak Ridge's entire enslaved community that would either massively reinforce control through brutal demonstration of the costs of resistance if the attempt succeeded without excessive white casualties, or would catastrophically undermine control by demonstrating that even overwhelming force could be resisted effectively, and that slavery's supposedly absolute power was actually constrained by calculations about whether enforcement costs exceeded the value that submission would provide. Most significantly, attempting to force submission would risk destroying expensive property if the violence required to overcome Kwame's resistance killed him or injured him so severely that his capacity for productive labor was permanently impaired, transforming an asset worth $1,500 into either a corpse or an invalid who would consume resources without generating value. According to the accounts that were preserved with remarkable consistency, Wright made a decision that shocked everyone present, including enslaved workers who understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted, even if they couldn't yet comprehend all the implications. He backed down from the confrontation, claiming in terms that fooled absolutely no one that perhaps punishment could be delayed until a more appropriate time, or that he needed to consult with Blake about proper procedures for disciplining someone of Kwame's unusual size, essentially retreating from the confrontation in ways that violated every principle about never showing weakness or uncertainty, and always enforcing submission immediately and absolutely, that overseers were trained to follow, and that slavery's operational logic insisted were essential to maintaining the psychological dominance that made control of large enslaved populations by small numbers of whites even theoretically possible. The retreat created immediate ripples throughout Oak Ridge's enslaved community as people recognized that someone had openly refused to submit to punishment, had explicitly threatened lethal violence, and had not been immediately and brutally crushed, but had instead witnessed the overseer retreat while offering transparent excuses about needing consultation that everyone recognized as face-saving fictions designed to conceal the fundamental concession that Wright had made by backing away from enforcing submission. What happened over the subsequent days and weeks created a situation that became increasingly difficult to resolve according to slavery's normal operational logic, and that exposed uncomfortable truths about the economic calculations that ultimately constrained the violence that the system depended upon, even while its ideology insisted such violence was unlimited and subject only to the will of masters and overseers who possessed absolute authority. Wright reported the confrontation to Blake, explaining Kwame's defiance and explicit threats and seeking authorization for assembling whatever force would be necessary to punish him, given his size, and demonstrated willingness to fight to death rather than submit. But Blake, according to accounts preserved in oral traditions and according to fragmentary evidence and correspondence where he discussed plantation management challenges with other Virginia slaveholders who faced similar situations, found himself confronting calculations that revealed truths about slavery's foundations that defenders of the system preferred to keep obscured from both enslaved people, who might be encouraged toward resistance if they understood them, and from whites whose commitment to slavery might waver if they recognized too clearly how economic considerations constrained violence that ideology claimed was absolute. Attempting to whip Kwame by force would require assembling multiple overseers and probably recruiting assistance from neighboring plantations. Would almost certainly result in injuries and quite possibly in deaths among those attempting to enforce submission. Would risk killing or permanently disabling Kwame himself through the level of violence that would be necessary to overcome resistance from someone of his size and strength and absolute determination, and would create a spectacle that could undermine control, even if successful, because the costs of enforcement would be visible to enslaved communities throughout the region, who would recognize that submission had been achieved only through violence so extreme that it revealed the limits rather than the unlimited nature of slavery's power. The cold economic calculation that Blake found himself forced to make, a calculation that he almost certainly wished he didn't have to perform explicitly because it revealed uncomfortable realities about slavery's operations, exposed something that the system's ideology worked to conceal. Violence was ultimately constrained by cost-benefit analyses that even brutal slaveholders had to perform, and in situations where enforcing absolute submission would require destroying expensive property and accepting substantial risks of casualties among overseers, while creating spectacles that might encourage rather than discourage resistance by demonstrating the costs that enforcement could entail, the supposedly absolute power that slavery claimed could be negotiated and compromised in ways that the system's logic insisted were impossible. Blake's decision, made after consultations with Wright, and apparently after at least one direct conversation with Kwame, whose content was never documented but whose outcome became clear through what followed, was to establish what amounted to an informal arrangement that violated every principle about how slavery was supposed to function. Kwame would not be whipped for his defiance or for any future infractions, would be assigned to work that utilized his extraordinary strength, but would not be subjected to the close supervision and constant threat of violence that governed other enslaved people's labor, would be left largely autonomous as long as he maintained productivity levels that Blake considered acceptable, and would essentially exist in a category that had no formal recognition within slavery's legal structures, but that operated as a kind of negotiated understanding where both sides recognized the terms, even though such terms could never be openly acknowledged without undermining the fiction that slavery's absolute power remained intact. This arrangement, which shocked enslaved workers at Oak Ridge, and which eventually became known at neighboring plantations as stories circulated through the networks connecting enslaved communities across the South Side, persisted for nearly 4 years from the initial confrontation in late 1839 until Kwame's death in July of 1843, from causes that accounts variably describe as heat stroke or heart failure suffered while working in tobacco fields during one of the region's hottest summers in living memory. During those 4 years, Kwame existed in a liminal space between slavery as the system was supposed to function and freedom as Virginia law recognized it. He worked because the arrangement required maintaining productivity that made his presence economically valuable to Blake. He maintained surface appearances of deference in interactions with whites that allowed Blake to preserve some fiction that proper hierarchies remained operational. But he was fundamentally not subject to the mechanisms of violence and constant surveillance that constituted slavery's essential nature, and that the system insisted were necessary to maintain control. The situation created complications that extended well beyond Kwame's individual circumstances, and that demonstrated why slaveholders were so insistent that any challenge to absolute authority had to be crushed immediately regardless of costs. Other enslaved people at Oak Ridge observed daily that someone had successfully resisted the violence that slavery depended upon and had created a space of relative autonomy, leading to subtle shifts in behavior as people tested whether protective space around Kwame might extend to others, or whether similar resistance from those lacking his size and strength would result in the catastrophic punishments that slavery typically inflicted. Wright and the other overseers found themselves navigating complicated dynamics, where they had to maintain control over most workers through traditional methods, while carefully avoiding confrontations with Kwame that might expose the fundamental concession that Blake had made and that might encourage others to believe that resistance was possible if costs of enforcement could be made high enough that even brutal slaveholders would calculate that submission wasn't worth the price that forcing it would require. The arrangement was never formally acknowledged in plantation records or correspondence that survived, operated instead as an open secret that everyone at Oak Ridge understood intimately and that people at neighboring plantations heard about through enslaved people's communication networks, but that no one could discuss openly without undermining the fiction that slavery's absolute power remained intact. The silence in official documentation about a situation that persisted for nearly 4 years demonstrates how carefully slaveholders controlled records to exclude anything suggesting the system's power was less than absolute. But the consistency and detail with which the story was preserved in oral traditions demonstrates that enslaved communities recognized the profound significance of what had happened and maintained careful memory of events that official records worked to erase. The broader implications of what occurred at Oak Ridge between 1839 and 1843 were profound, even though the situation was exceptional and dependent on specific circumstances that couldn't be readily replicated. Kwame's extraordinary size and strength that made forcing submission genuinely dangerous, his demonstrated willingness and psychological capacity to choose death, fighting over acceptance of ritualistic violence. Blake's calculation that enforcement costs exceeded whatever benefits absolute dominance provided, and the existence of an enslaved community that witnessed the confrontation and understood its significance, even though open discussion would have been dangerous. The story served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that slavery's absolute power could be challenged under certain circumstances. It revealed economic calculations underlying violence that ideology concealed. It showed that masters performed cost-benefit analyses about whether enforcement was worth casualties and property destruction involved. And most subversively, it suggested that violence was constrained by considerations that could be exploited when conditions aligned properly. The story also served as complicated inspiration that came with cautions. Kwame's resistance created relative autonomy, but not actual freedom. The arrangement depended on his continued productivity and Blake's tolerance, protection didn't extend reliably to others, and everything could be terminated if Blake decided maintenance costs exceeded benefits. Yet within these limitations, the story demonstrated that power wasn't as absolute as slavery claimed, that violence was bounded by economic realities that ideology concealed, and that resistance could create negotiations within a system designed to make such negotiations impossible. Kwame's death in July 1843 apparently occurred during fieldwork on a day when temperatures reached levels that killed several people throughout the South Side. His collapse and death witnessed by multiple workers who described how he simply stopped moving during the afternoon heat and died within minutes despite attempts to revive him. Blake's response to the death revealed the complicated economics that had governed the entire situation. He apparently expressed genuine distress at losing property that had generated substantial value through 4 years of productive labor, without requiring the kind of intensive supervision and frequent punishment that managing other workers demanded. He recognized that replacing Kwame's capabilities through normal market purchases was essentially impossible, given that individuals of comparable size and strength were extraordinarily rare and commanded premium prices when available. And he apparently acknowledged, at least privately, that the arrangement that had developed had actually been economically beneficial, despite violating every principle about how slavery was supposed to function, because the costs avoided by not having to use violence to force submission exceeded whatever benefits absolute dominance would have provided. And sometimes, according to legends that communities preserved when official records remained silent about complications challenging the system's fundamental claims, resistance involved neither escape nor death in confrontation nor submission that slavery demanded, but rather something more ambiguous and perhaps more subversive: the creation of spaces where someone stood 7 feet 6 inches tall and demonstrated that death fighting was preferable to ritualistic submission, where a slaveholder calculated that enforcing dominance cost more than tolerating defiance, and where for nearly 4 years an arrangement persisted that everyone understood violated fundamental principles but that no one could acknowledge without exposing uncomfortable truths about power's limitations. Demonstrating that slavery's violence, however brutal, was ultimately bounded by economic realities that ideology worked to conceal. That even seemingly absolute power involved calculations that could be manipulated when circumstances aligned, and that resistance could take forms challenging the system's logic even when outcomes were neither triumph of escape nor tragedy of death, but rather the complicated persistence of negotiated autonomy within a system designed to make such negotiations impossible, proving that the absolute power slavery claimed was actually constrained by economic considerations that could be exploited by those with capability and determination to impose costs that even brutal slaveholders ultimately decided were too high to pay.